Hi, and getting back into Warhammer Fantasy after over a decade, finding, of course, Fantasy Battle has turned into Age of Sigmar. I've been preparing not only by reading as much as I can, but watching a lot of battle reports. It's quite nice that there's quite a few YouTube channels that show battle reports and really show what people are thinking as they're doing it as well, and what their plans are. And you can start to see when you're watching people play the mistakes they're making, and particularly the ones who ultimately lose, especially if they lose big. And what I was thinking back to is the days when I was playing Fantasy Battle and wanted to get myself ready for tournaments, and how I tried to learn what would be effective. Because you can do it by trial and error, but the problem is you playing against certain people. You can learn what works against them. It's not necessarily what's going to work in a tournament. And what you want really is to circumvent the process by reading up on things. Now, there's not a lot written on Warhammer tactics and strategy, but there are sources, ancient texts, including Sun Tzu's Art of War. Now, of course, an awful lot of this relates to dealing with people, management, that sort of thing. You don't have to worry about that for Warhammer, but there are an awful lot of wisdom in those texts which are directly attributable to any contest, quite frankly, but most especially to a battle simulation. And I'm going to go through a few of these in a series of videos. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the pre-planning, the pre-battle, the army building effectively. That is where you plan without necessarily knowing what you're going to come up against, because there are a number of factors, variables that you need to consider, but you can't really know. And there's variables are in terms of the battle plan that's going to be used, but you know what the choices are for that. The terrain. Sometimes a battlefield has a few bits of terrain. Sometimes it's awash with terrain. And of course, your opponent, the army that they've got, the specific army that they've made, the roster, as well as artifacts of power, which spells they're taking, things like that. So the first quote from Sun Tzu's Art of War, which I'm going to discuss here, is: "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." In other words, those who have the best chance of winning are ones who've thought things through beforehand, rather than just making them, oh, it seems to be a balanced army, I'll take it along and see how it goes, and then try and work things up on the fly. Not only is that more difficult because you're giving yourself much less time, but you may find a paper, rock, scissors situation where you've come up against something that you cannot expose its weaknesses, and it can absolutely tear your weaknesses open. So it's important to consider a few things. Now, in terms of those variables, because some people, again, will say, well, I don't know what I'm going to come against. In a tournament, you're going to be playing 5 or 6 armies. They could all be different armies. They could all be different, not just types of army, but specific rosters, all the rest of it. But let's break a few things down. So with the terrain, first of all, that's the easiest one. The competition rules may sort of say how much terrain you can expect. And a lot of the tournament photos I've been seeing, there's a bit of terrain there, but it's not excessive. So there's open areas as well as a few areas where you need to be able to sneak through. The skirmish nature of the game sort of helps there. But again, you need to consider that. Is your army going to be able to hold the large open sections of the field, as well as have you got parts of your army that are able to negotiate any tighter areas in there as well? When it comes to the battle plan, yes, there's a range of different battle plans, but ultimately they focus on 2 things. 1, can you contain or preferably crush the enemy, but can you at least contain them? And 2, can you capture the objectives? Sometimes the location of those objectives is known from the start. Sometimes they don't become apparent until later on in the battle. So have you got the flexibility and the speed with which to take them or not? And then the third thing, which appears to be the most variable, where it is the army. So it's the specific type of army. Is it an ever-chosen army? Is it a Nighthaunt army? What sort of army are you going to come across? Your opponent, it might be an army where you could go more in one way than the other. Again, you don't know. You don't know which artifacts of power they'll have taken till you actually meet them, what spells they've taken, anything like that. How do you all plan that in advance? So what you do for this is you think about the 4 ways your opponent can hurt you. Doesn't matter what army they've got. There's 4 areas in which they can hurt you. And just for the sake of alliteration, I break it down to the 4 M's for no other reason. Movement, magic, missiles, and melee. So when it comes to movement, what you ideally want is strong movement. Now, how can you get that? Now, the Night Haunt army I'm building up, I think it's fair to say, has very strong movement. The whole army can fly. You've got some units that have very high movement speed. I define it as just being 10 plus. So there's about half the army has got high movement speed, or not quite half, maybe a third of the army high movement speed from that point of view, but it can all fly. Half of it can reserve, so that's always useful. You can reserve it in the second turn of the movement phase if I want. I can plonk it down the battlefield wherever I like. Obviously the usual restriction, not within 9 inches of an enemy unit. But that gives me a lot of flexibility there. There's a particular ability I can have as well, where I can just get a unit and teleport it. Again, there's certain restrictions on where, but nonetheless, get a unit to go as I like. So very, very strong movement, which will not only help me get to objectives more easily, but it can also help me to, as I'll talk about a little bit later, direct my opponent's movement as well. Then there's magic. So this is about, if you are going to be relying on certain spells yourself, have you got a good chance to get them off? Or not, because of course your opponent might well be able to unbind them. And if you're not that bothered about the magic yourself, but have you got the capacity to unbind your opponent's potentially devastating spells? Particularly if they've got a very nasty endless spell, something like that. So in my particular army, I've got 3 wizards. 2 of them wizards by right. One of them are going to get an artifact of power that will make them a wizard. So that's 3 being able to cast something. So, you know, assuming I can make the rolls, which hopefully more times than not I will, I've got the capacity to get those off. Even if I'm close enough for my opponent to try and unbind them, they're probably not going to be able to unbind all of them. And in the defensive part of it, again, as long as I can get them close enough to the opposing wizards, I've got a decent chance of at least attempting to unbind all of my opponent's spells if I wish to. Then there's missiles. Now, obviously, a Night Haunt army, missiles, virtually nothing. There's a short range missile attack I can make with the Black Coach, but basically there's nothing there. I'm not going to make any gains in the shooting phase, but I can potentially take losses. So again, how do you manage that situation? There's 2 ways of managing it. You can either try and ensure that you take minimal to 0 losses. Again, remember, you can't necessarily rely on terrain because you don't necessarily know exactly how the terrain's going to be when you're planning your army. You may or may not, it depends which game you're playing. If you're playing at a local club and you know what it's all set out like and the scenery is sort of fixed, then you will do. If it's not and you're going to take turns in moving the scenery, then you won't do. If it's a tournament, you won't do. The other side of it is to protect them in some way. And then the third type is just to be able to heal up those wounds. As with an undead army, of course, you can replenish your unit. If it loses models, you have ways of bringing some of them back. So that helps there. And with the Night Haunts, you've got a bit of both because, again, 1, fly, that's really useful for getting into cover and then getting out of it. You can just go straight through the cover that you've found on your next turn when you wish to move. You've got a 4+ save, which can't be modified at all. So that's always useful. And I've also got the capacity to, as I say, raise models back up if any are lost from the normal units, that is not, of course, the heroes. And then there's melee, so getting into combat. And again, there'll be some armies that will be stronger than me for that. There'll be some that are not so strong. But again, the fact that I can replenish lost numbers there means that, you know, you can sort of win a war of attrition. So you're thinking about those 4 areas. I try and identify which armies are strongest in each of those 4 areas. Imagine that you came across one. How would you deal with it? And if you can deal with each of those 4 things independently, then you will certainly be able to deal with them collectively because no one will be strong in all 4 areas. And they may well have weaknesses where you can find opportunities yourself. Now, the next quote I'm going to pick on is also really important. And a reason why, even though I'm wanting to get into Age of Sigmar, Kill Team and 40k again, I'm only going to be doing the Age of Sigmar super seriously, and it is this. To know your enemy, you must become your enemy. So in Warhammer, what that effectively means is making sure you understand everything about all the armies you could possibly come up against. In other words, reading all the codices for 40k or battle tomes for Age of Sigmar. That puts you at a massive advantage. If you understand what you're up against, of course, your opponent will show you the roster, you can ask questions about it, sure. But you want an innate understanding. You want to know that unit, oh, it has these abilities, because then you can, as they're deploying it even, the cogs are turning. You're not just getting a quick overview, which you will then forget immediately. You understand intrinsically. There was a case just back when I was playing Warhammer Fantasy, when I was playing against, I talked about this recently, I was playing against a Dark Elf player, and they tried to move cavalry onto my flank where I had some rattling guns, which are there specifically to deal with anything trying to attack my flank, but most especially having a field day against cavalry. And because I felt that this person was, using this tactic because they were unfamiliar with what the rattling gun could do, I felt honour bound to at least explain it to them, just to be a good sport. They still did it anyway. It was a bit stupid. And then they got annihilated. Surprise, surprise. But the thing is, you could argue that even moving to the position where he was about to do it, he may not have done if he'd have fully appreciated what these things can do. So again, looking at the army and knowing what each unit can do, before it comes time for you to need to say to your opponents, oh, what can they do again? Because you're about now to have crunch time. You can develop your tactics more suitably. And the only way to do that is to read through all these. And it's an awful lot of reading to become as well versed in other armies as the one or ones you play yourself. Takes a lot of time. And with 40k, the problem for me is that most of those other armies, I'm not interested at all. Chaos Space Marines, sort of. Death Guard, most specifically, Nurgle is what I'm most interested in. And Necrons, I like those armies. I don't really like any of the others. I'm not very interested in that. Not so much in how they play, but just the background of I'm not very interested. So I'm not really likely to buy all the codices and be motivated enough to read them through. Whereas the battle tomes in Age of Sigmar, absolutely. There are some armies I know I'm not going to play. Obviously I can't play all of them anyway. It would take far too much time and money. But I don't even intend to play all of them. But I'm interested in all of them. And I will happily get a battle tome each month and read it through several times, become familiar, and keep going back to ones that I haven't looked at for a while to keep my memory up to date. And eventually I'm hoping that when I start going to tournaments next year, about a year's time, that I will be well enough versed in all of them that someone's going to lay out their arm in front of me. I'm going to know exactly what it does, apart from the artifacts of power and spells, which they'll show me on their roster, and that I'll be familiar enough to be able to work out straight away what the strengths and weaknesses are, and which of my units are going to be best for countering which of their units, and which of my units I need to keep away from which of their units as well. And the final one I want to talk about just in this part here is a really crucial one, because a lot of people mix these up as well. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Now, a lot of people do get confused between strategy and tactics, and some people use them interchangeably. So, in a nutshell, the difference between them is strategy is what you need to do, and tactics is how you're going to do it. So the strategy, for example, will depend on the battle plan to a certain extent. But remember, that battle plan tends to take the form of crush the enemy, capture objectives. With some battle plans, capturing the objectives is ultra important. So then it might be capture the objectives, contain the enemy. In some of them, the objectives may be less important. It's much more important if you can crush the enemy, then that will render the normal objectives null and void. So in a case like that, then it becomes more important to be able to engage and defeat the enemy there. Whereas tactics is the individual steps how you're going to do it. So as soon as you know what the battle plan is, you know what the strategy needs to be. But how are you going to accomplish it? It's all very well saying, oh, I need to get someone onto that objective, someone onto that objective, someone onto this objective, and keep the enemy away from all of them. How are you going to do it? Those are your tactics. And those are some things that you can develop ahead of time, because you can plan for all the different types of battle plan. Battle plans, as I say, they're all move towards objectives which could be in any number of places. Can you move quickly around them? And can you contain the enemy? Can you at least hold them up, preferably defeat them? And that's ultimately what it is. And capturing objectives, as I've said before, you can accomplish this effectively with strong movement. You want things that can fly is always useful. Being able to hold them in reserve, because if objectives appear in turn 2, such as the one with the meteors, and you can make things appear in turn 2, well, you can get it as close as you can to it without getting within 9 inches of enemy, then that can be a benefit to you there. Just having high movement speed is also really useful. In my particular Nighthaunt Army 2K Nighthaunt Army, the one that I've planned, I've got a Black Coach, high movement speed. I've got a unit Hex Raids, high movement speed. Knight of Shrouds on Ethereal Steed, high movement speed. And Vampire Lord allied but can fly, high movement speed there. And they can all fly as well, so they can go through obstacles. They can go over friendly and opposing units just to get to where they need to get to. It's all absolutely marvellous from that point of view. So those are the general things I consider when I'm planning an army myself, and as I'm planning my armies as well. I'm going to talk in the next episode about deployment and initial engagement, and draw on again some practical examples, some sort of from the past, some more relevant now in terms of what I've been observing in other people's battle reports. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe for further content, and share with others who might also be interested. Until next time, I'll see you later.